Well, welcome everyone to our Tree Week webinar this afternoon. Today we're going to be talking evergreens and how to pick the best evergreens for the bluegrass. As the title says, it's a deciduous world out there in Kentucky. We have a lot of great deciduous trees. We have wonderful diversity, but when it comes to evergreens, it's a lot trickier. And so our presenter today, Brandon George, who's the Kenton County Horticulture Extension Agent, is going to be talking with us about this common problem. My name is Ellen Crocker, and I'm the Forest Health Extension Specialist here at the University of Kentucky, and we're excited to be celebrating all things tree with you this week for Tree Week. We love trees all the time, but this is a week when we try to really recognize what they do and have lots of different topics in our webinar series. Brandon, we are so excited to have you here today.
Thank you, Ellen. Yeah, I'm very excited. And thank you all for joining me with this presentation. It's something I'm very passionate about and excited to share with you what I've learned. So I think as an agenda, what we'll talk about today, what an evergreen plant actually is, defining it, considerations for growing evergreen trees and plants in general, ones to avoid or reconsider perhaps, and then we'll talk a little bit about some recommended species that you might not be aware of or you might be aware of, and kind of how I sourced a lot of the ones I've come to want to have and acquire. So the reason I want to do this is because obviously, as Ellen said, we are limited in what evergreens naturally grow in the ecoregion that is represented within the outer bluegrass and inner and outer bluegrass, which is represented of central kind of Kentucky and northern Kentucky. And so I want to kind of give you the information that I have found through research. So what is an evergreen plant? We'll just talk about what that is. Botanically speaking, an evergreen plant is one in which that has foliage that remains green and functional throughout more than one growing season. Sometimes 3-4 years, even longer, depending on the species of plant. They can hold onto their leaves before they ultimately will drop them. So nothing is permanently evergreen. Needles and leaves eventually all are shed in age, but they do persist longer than a deciduous tree, which would drop its leaves within a single growing season. Obviously, too, with evergreens, they photosynthesize and transpire throughout winter, which is both good and bad. So those are considerations to have as well when you do have these trees. So a semi-evergreen tree, when we're talking about that, we're referring to those that are primarily evergreen, but in a colder climate where they can survive. They sometimes adapt by shedding their leaves. And around here, you might see two that are more obvious. So sometimes you see things like leatherleaf viburnum, which will have evergreen leaves for a long period of time, especially if they're in a sheltered spot, but will eventually drop them when it gets below a certain degree. And then also the sweet bay magnolia, Magnolia virginiana, which will eventually drop its leaves too, but in a warmer, slightly warmer zone, those would persist throughout winter. So we'll skip this. This is specifically to our Kenton County, where I'm from, Kenton County in North Kentucky, but a lot of the same soil associations would primarily pertain to central Kentucky. So if you look at this map here in the pink, Ordovician, so we have limestone soils. Naturally, our pH is more alkaline. And so growing conifers in this particular ecoregion is a little bit of a challenge because most conifers do like a more acidic pH, and we often have clay soil. And so that can sometimes be another challenge for those that like more of a well-drained soil, but that doesn't mean we can't grow them here too. But I just wanted to give this as a representative of kind of the area where we are partly. If you're in Eastern Kentucky, you have a bit more of an advantage to growing a lot of evergreens, so you're lucky that way. Like anything in horticulture and gardening, we always want to really choose and make the best informed decision with gardening or with planting anything. So the right plant for the right place is always an adage that I try to follow. If you are going to plant evergreens, you want to do it during either the early spring, March to May, or maybe through September, October in the autumn. Of course, I would say autumn might be ideal, primarily because you're kind of past the heat of the summer. But regardless of that, if it's dry like it is now, you want to be very careful, as these plants will continue to photosynthesize as the deciduous trees go dormant. So you want to particularly be careful to make sure these get watered in the fall and remain watered until the ground freezes, just because you can have some issues with desiccation, which we'll talk about. Conifers most prefer full sun, but some can tolerate some afternoon shade or some dappled sunlight, which you might find in those that naturally grow along deciduous trees in an understory setting, perhaps. And also, again, when trees are growing closer together and those in a dense canopy, more shade will result in fewer branches, and they'll be less dense as compared to if they would be growing in full sun. If you are growing evergreens in a hot, humid climate, which a lot of conifers are not adapted to, or they don't love particularly, some don't, you just want to make sure that you have consistent soil moisture, and otherwise you can risk defoliation. A lot of our beloved spruces can struggle quite a lot in a drought, and sometimes by the time it's showing symptoms of drought, it can be too late. So you want to just keep a close eye on soil moisture levels with a lot of conifers especially. So being that conifers prefer cooler and moist soil, mulching is really beneficial for the root systems to remain less stressed out from heat stress and drought. 1 to 3 inches deep is really great. And obviously the mulch should not touch the actual stem or base of the root and trunk. They typically do not need to be staked once they're established. They are not heavy feeders. They're adapted to poor nutrient soils, and so you might not have to fertilize them too well. Our soils are quite naturally rich in nutrients locally, so we're kind of okay. But the only thing is, I would say sometimes when you're planting a young conifer, they can be prone to deer damage or rodent damage from girdling. So if you need to protect them with a guard or cage, that might be something to consider if you have that issue. One thing I wanted to mention too, and I think a lot of people use the word conifer and evergreen interchangeably, but it's not necessarily the case. And we can go through some of these, but not every evergreen is a conifer, and not every conifer is an evergreen. So just keep that in mind when we use those terms. One thing to consider, this was particularly bad this past winter, late December of last year, when there was a lot of desiccation happening with our evergreen plants. And that happened because there was a rapid cool down in temperature as well as strong winds, which when you have evergreen plants that continue to transpire when there's wind and sunlight and the ground's frozen, or it's just very dry, they can get windburn, they can get drought symptoms even when it's very, very cold. So you want to make sure going into a dry period when it gets really cold, if you can water them in well before the ground is frozen, it's really something to think about and consider with evergreens, whether it's broadleaf or conifers. Broadleaf are a bit more susceptible to winds, but conifers too can struggle as well. 1 inch per week is ideal and adequate for a lot of our conifers and evergreens locally if we don't get enough rain to suffice that requirement. You can create wind barriers with burlap that can kind of slow down the wind speed and also protect them from sun scald when they're trying to photosynthesize and the soil is frozen. So that can kind of protect them a little bit. Mulching, of course, too, protects the root zone from freezing. And yeah, just good culture in general, looking out for them when it's dry and checking for symptoms of disease or planting them in the wrong spot and moving them if they have to be moved. This is just an example of what can happen during a winter through either sun scald or desiccation damage from strong winds and frozen soil. So you can see on one side of that dwarf Alberta spruce in the middle, there's some damage there. And that conifer, I don't know which one that is, but the one on the left, obviously there's some winter damage going on there. And then there's an example of burlap to protect something like boxwood or some kind of evergreen, which is a great way to protect things from wind damage. And snow loads too. Sometimes snow loads can also break conifers and evergreens as well. Pruning conifers in general, you have to be very careful with pruning them. Typically they cannot be pruned nearly as hard as you would a deciduous tree or shrub. Typically you cannot cut into old wood, meaning that wood that is bare and free of branches or needles or leaves, and they don't often regrow. Taxus is an example of an exception of that rule. The yew plant, you can cut that back very hard into old wood, and it usually does respond in time. Buxus too, boxwood. If you do want to kind of slow down the growth of evergreens, especially conifers, there's something called candling where you can remove the newest growth of those plants. That helps them that helps maintain their dwarf size, but eventually you cannot do it indefinitely. They have to continue to put on new growth because they cannot hold those older leaves or needles forever. Ideal time to prune is between March and August when things are more actively growing. Doing them in colder times can lead to infection and things like that. So typically, again, with conifers especially, being that we can't prune them back as hard, plant them where they can grow to accommodate their full size. Even when something's considered to be a dwarf, really think about that long term because it might outgrow the space. And then once it does, it's going to not do great if you have to prune it back really hard. And like I said, some plants such as broadleaf evergreens are more forgiving of pruning harder. Things like hollies, magnolias, boxwood, rhododendrons, and they can resprout given enough time. Soil considerations. A lot of people think if you plant a pine tree, it will naturally reduce the pH. From what I understand, I don't think that's actually true. So the parent material and soil that's already there will dictate the soil pH and that soil texture. And structure. But I would say you need to make sure when you're thinking about your site considerations for most evergreens and conifers, you want to look for an area that's well drained, making sure that it's not a low spot, especially if you have heavy clay soil that dries out very slowly. If you don't have that, I would say look for a spot that's somewhat on a slope because then you can have better draining soil. Fungal rot can be a big issue with evergreens. So before you think you have a chlorosis issue due to an alkaline soil or a nutrient deficiency, get your soil tested at the county extension offices locally for you. You can get that done for free. So definitely check that out if you're worried about your evergreen plant not looking too great. Being that heavy clay soils, which we kind of have here a lot locally in the Bluegrass ecoregion, they have a high CEC ratio, meaning that effectively they bind nutrients very tightly and they do not leach easily. So it's difficult sometimes to alter the pH quickly. If you have a pH that's very alkaline and you're trying to get it closer to neutral or more acidic, you will have to give it time to use elemental sulfur to bring that pH down. But if you have heavy clay, it's going to take a little bit longer. So for most conifers, 5.5 is ideal, but they have a more tolerable range depending on the species, and that's key for selection. Some conifers and evergreens can take a much more alkaline soil, and those are what we want to look for in our plant selection. Conduct a soil test if you're unsure if your soil is suitable. Again, take advantage of those resources. Says, quick example of a soil pH chart. When you have an alkaline soil, you're going to have deficiencies, typically of the nutrients iron, manganese, boron, and sometimes magnesium, but mostly iron, manganese, and boron. And you will notice there will be a pale yellow or yellow look to the leaves. And it might not be very sudden, it might be gradual, but you'll notice that they don't look quite right and they might be paler than usual. So that's an indicator. And so when soil is the incorrect pH for that plant, a lot of those nutrients are not available for those plants to take up, even if they're present in the soil in abundance. So in the wrong pH, they can not be used by the plant. So that's why having the right pH is so important. It might not be a nutrient deficiency. It might just be a pH issue. Chlorosis of white pine. So this is what could happen potentially if you have growing a conifer or an evergreen in a soil that the pH is just too high. In this case, you're going to see chlorosis here, especially between veins of new leaves. You'll see pine needles looking very pale and yellow, and they might look more sparse than usual. I think sometimes with chlorosis, you'll see them dropping those needles sooner than they normally would. So to reduce soil pH, there's two options. For a smaller plant like a shrub, you might be able to make a berm where you raise the soil above the natural soil level, and therefore you can use things like peat moss and topsoil to kind of build up that soil with the ideal soil for that plant. With a tree, that's not really the case because you just can't build one big enough for the root system to stay within that berm. So ideally, you want to change and alter the soil at least a year before you plant to give that sulfur to work its way through the soil. And with using elemental sulfur, it needs to be taken up by microbes and kind of breaking down and working its way through the soil. So you need to have it applied, and it's only going to kind of work when it's warmer. So you want to do it in the fall or early spring, and then it's going to take a while for those microbes to break those that element down and make it available to the plant and work its way through the soil. So keep that in mind. Based on a soil chart, you'll have to figure out how much sulfur you will need to alter the pH depending on how much of a change. So there's calculators online that you can use, but elemental sulfur is a great choice. Aluminum sulfate can be toxic, so I would kind of suggest you avoid that if at all possible. It does work more effectively, but aluminum toxicity can be an issue. So I would still stick with elemental sulfur, even though it takes longer. So again, it reacts very slowly. So you want to make sure you give yourself plenty of time before you plant that plant that you're considering that needs a lower pH. Okay, so before we get into the list of plants to consider, I just want to go through a few that I would suggest for our particular region in the outer bluegrass, inner bluegrass ecoregion that I would reconsider based on the parent present soil here in an unaltered state. So blue spruce, I think while these are still very popular plants, it's kind of rare now to see them in an adult stage looking great before they succumb pretty much always to rhizosphere needlecast, which is a fungal issue that they get. They are not well adapted to our hot, humid summers, especially as climate change is affecting our area. A lot of conifers especially are going to no longer be adapted or work well in our landscapes. So we want to think about that as our climate changes. Which ones are we going to kind of take off the list of not to plant? So blue spruce would be one I would suggest. Canadian hemlocks, you'll find these in eastern Kentucky. They are very shade tolerant as far as conifers go, but I would say unless you're in an isolated spot, they're very prone to getting hemlock woolly adelgid. So be careful of planting those in mass numbers. And but sometimes you'll see some looking really great, so you might get lucky there. But I would just be careful with how big of an issue that pest is. Boxwood, while they can tolerate the pH, they have a lot of blight and insect issues. They were obviously damaged quite a lot by the winter we had this past year. And Cornell has a really great trial program of the best cultivars out there. But I would say there's other choices besides boxwood that you could look into for better evergreen shrubs. Inkberry holly, Japanese holly, they're a little bit prone to yellowing in alkaline soils, but if amended, they can be okay. Austrian pine, you sometimes see this planted in landscapes. It is susceptible to needle blight. I would just be careful of that. So you'll see it kind of looking a bit more sparse as it gets more mature. White fir, Abies concolor. Summers are too hot and humid here. Struggles to get to a mature size looking great. Scots pine, sometimes they can look really great, but I see quite a few with needle blight and the tips looking kind of red and orange, as well as having kind of a lower pH tolerance. White pine, I love this plant dearly, but I will say in a heavy clay soil, in an alkaline soil, they can kind of just very quickly struggle and die. So I would say you can plant them and they can do really great sometimes and look wonderful, but other times you can plant them in a very similar spot and they'll just completely fail. So I would say plant a few for insurance purposes and hope for the best. They don't really love our heavy clay alkaline soil, and they are prone to chlorosis too. In general, what you really want to look for are conifers and evergreens that have a small pH tolerance, those that are intolerant of hot, humid summers, and those that will struggle on heavy clay. So knowing the nativity of these plants will help you indicate whether or not they might thrive or at least tolerate your local conditions. So some of the ones I want to recommend, a lot of these you might be familiar with or might not be familiar with, but I want to share them regardless. And some of them I put on here whether they're easy or not to source. Some of the ones we've been planting at our site are very rare and hard to find, but I'm hoping that in the decades to come, they will be more available because the ones we planted to showcase the best evergreens are those I'm hoping based on research through local people that they'll be more adapted to Kentucky of the future and what we're looking at with our climate. So Cryptomeria japonica, Japanese cedar. I love these evergreens. They're wonderful as a hedge. They can be dwarf, they can be straight species. They're typically pretty resistant to deer damage. They do suffer sometimes from winter bronzing, but even so, they're quite beautiful and ornamental. They grow very, very straight, so they can be wonderful as an alley, but as a hedge, they do well. And they have very great salt tolerance. They're native to Japan. They grow right along the ocean, and so they can take a lot of wind and salt. They're pretty easy to source too. Typically getting the straight species of Japanese cedar is a bit of a challenge, but ones like radicans are fairly accessible to get. They should take full sun. They don't do well in heavy shade. Their pH tolerance 5 to 7 works pretty well for us here. I think they are pretty tolerant of a 7 pH, and they're definitely hardy. Abies normandiana. This has been considered by the University of Kentucky and other publications as perhaps the best fir species for Kentucky landscapes. Most firs really do not do well here for us for a number of reasons. The hardiness zone is 4 to 6. Now, we might be close to 7 in a lot of our zones here in Kentucky, 6 to 7. But I've seen this looking really great at a number of gardens, including I'm trying to think right now of the Arboretum outside of Louisville, Bernheim. There's some really great mature specimens there. I would encourage you to check out if you're near there. This is a really great fir. It holds its needles for a long time, full sun apart shade, has a great pH tolerance, but unfortunately it's pretty hard to source online. Conifer Kingdom, I found, is an online source that does have them, but these are very majestic trees. They have a very dark needle, so they are a great background tree and shrub to kind of showcase a lighter foliage in the foreground. Abies normandiana, subspecies Trojani, Bohr-Mueller's fir. So this is a subspecies of the fir we just showed. I just looked at the last slide. I would say, again, the only real difference is that the plants have a more denser and blunter needle and form a V-shaped groove. I found this from Red Panda Nursery, which is, I think, an online nursery in Michigan. And again, these were really small trees when we got them, so they were about a foot tall both. And again, similar situation with the pH tolerance, needle hold, very, very dark needles, very stiff as well. But apparently it's supposed to do really well for us here in our winters. They went through our winters this past year fine. They were both planted in the fall, and they came out of the winter and spring looking flawless. They looked great. King Boar's fir. So I should tell you, a lot of these species, I came up with this list by working with people through research through the University of Kentucky, as well as looking at the Boone County Arboretum and the Spring Grove Arboretum. So they have similar conditions to what we experience here in Northern Kentucky. And so through asking with the Arboretum staff and curators, I came up with this list of the best ones. So a lot of these might be unfamiliar for the reason because they're not always that familiar yet, but hopefully they will be in the future. This fir I've never seen in person and do not have at our site, but very similar to Abies normandiana. A lot of these come from the Caucasus, so near Turkey and Greece and those regions. So some of them have really hot summers that are quite dry, and they have a higher pH tolerance, which is really wonderful. So this one, again, hardiness zone 5 to 7, very great persistent needle hold, but unfortunately it's difficult to source. So, and I've not found a source for it yet, but I'm looking for one. Sicilian fir. This is a really cool tree that I've seen abundantly at Spring Grove Arboretum. They're statuesque, quite narrow trees, and they do wonderful. Apparently, they have maybe the greatest pH tolerance of a fir that we can tolerate here. So up to 8.5, which is kind of insane to think about if that's really true. That's a very, very alkaline soil. They are hardy between 5 and 9. Being that it goes all the way to 9 means that if we are looking at a hotter, humid summer, that means that hopefully they can tolerate our summers in the future for another few decades. They're pretty similar in their form to Turkish fir, but again, hard to source. I've been trying to get these from seed, and even that's hard. I don't know if people are going to grow these in mass in 20 years and that's where all the seed's going, but hopefully that's the case because I really want one for our site too. If you're ever in the Cincinnati area, go check these out at Spring Grove. That is a photo of them there behind some tombstones, and they're really gorgeous. They form really strong silhouettes in the landscape in winter. You might have seen this plant. I think some people love it, some people hate it. I don't love chartreuse evergreens. I think they look kind of radioactive, but everyone has their preferences. So this is called Chemiciferous Piscifera golden mop. These are quite common as a shrub evergreen species. They're really easy to source. They have a very strong color in full sun if you like that. So great contrast with a lot of other maybe bluer or redder or green foliage or stems. Great pH tolerance. I would say the biggest issue with these is that people plant these in a space that's way too small for their eventual size. And people want to kind of prune these into a meatball, which is fine, but that's not how they want to grow. And eventually, if you keep keeping them at the same size, they're going to get kind of bare and patchy with old wood because they want to outgrow their space. And so I would consider these to be a small tree. 15 by 10 feet is pretty common with these in maybe 10, 15, 20 years. So I would give these ample space to grow, but they are very hardy here. They do quite well for us. And again, give them a well-drained spot and they should be fine. Norway spruce. This might be the most popular planted non-native conifer in our state or maybe the whole eastern United States. And for pretty good reason. This is an extremely cold hardy plant, but I think in the future, this is one I would watch out for as far as how adapted it's going to be to our summers in the future. They can get rhizosphere and needlecast. We don't see that nearly as much as we do on blue spruces, but again, as it gets warmer, that could be an issue. A lot of people plant these close together and form windbreaks, which can work as long as you give them enough space. Over time, of course, the branches get more open and weeping in habit, and they are very lovely trees. They do very well for us here, have a great pH tolerance, very easy to source. Of all the trees that are non-native conifers, evergreens to this area, they're probably the easiest ones to source still. So people really do love this plant, and for good reason, they do pretty well still. Picea orientalis. This to me is such an underutilized tree, and I do not know why it is so difficult to get in the trade. I don't understand. This is such a lovely tree. I think a lot of people from a distance will look at this and think, oh, it's Norway spruce. But the big giveaways is if you look at this tree up close, it has the shortest needles of any spruce. And while they have the same color and maybe similar form to Norway spruce, they're a bit more narrow, but their needles are very, very short and stiff. And this tree, again, according to research with UKY and others, this is a really great tree that has great heat and drought tolerance, great windbreak potential, good pH tolerance, and loves full sun. Impossible to source this tree. Don't know why. I'm trying to grow it from seed. We have one at our site that someone planted 10, 15 years ago. That's about 25 feet tall, and it's gorgeous. It's a really beautiful tree, and I think we're going to see more of these in the future, decades to come, hopefully. Chihuahua spruce. I was completely unfamiliar with this tree before I started researching, but talking with Chris Stone at the Boone County Arboretum, we were talking about what tree can we replace a blue spruce with that gives us that same kind of look. And we found out apparently that this spruce, native to, I think it's either Mexico or Spain. It might be Mexico. Yeah, it's Mexico, sorry. Has a great heat tolerance for our hotter summers to come. So if we're looking at a blue spruce replica for our future, this might be the one. Unfortunately, this is super hard to find. I have yet to find a source for it, but it has blue silver foliage, and from a distance, it looks very much like our Colorado blue spruce that we really love in our landscape. So this could potentially be a replacement for it. Has a good pH tolerance and very heat tolerant. And again, coming from Mexico, it's quite heat tolerant, so that would make sense. Cedrus deodara, the deodara cedar. So naturally, this straight species doesn't really do well as far as hardiness goes at the moment. Now, there's cultivars out there called Shalimar Carl Fuchs, which are hardiness, they're rated to zone 6. We have at our office Shalimar, and apparently this does quite well. It has a pretty good pH tolerance as far as cedars go, and it has the hardiness we need. If you were to plant a straight species, I'm not sure how this would do, especially with the last year winter we had. There might be some serious dieback on it. This is not, it's somewhat difficult to source, but you can find it online if you're looking for the cultivars. So the nice thing too is that the cedars have a really good tolerance for our hot, humid summers. So potentially we might see more of these. And this is kind of a blue-green cast. So if you're looking for a great conifer with a different shade of blue or green, this might be a good choice. Lebanese cedar, the very famous Lebanese cedars. The form of the straight species is a little different to the one you might find as the cultivars. This is a hard to source tree, and the nice thing is that the cultivar, the variety Stenicoma, is available and it does quite well. In that picture, you can see it's very straight. It doesn't get quite as large as a straight species, but it's quite a great tree on its own. Has wonderful tolerance for our pH, so up to 8.2. And it is hard to source, unfortunately, but look out for this tree in the future. It might be one we might see more of. Eastern arborvitae. So believe it or not, arborvitaes, for a lot of people don't realize, they're actually native to kind of northern provinces of the United States as well as Canada. This is a really, really adaptable tree and shrub in our case, the way we grow it a lot of times. We typically grow the one called, I think, the green, I forget what the cultivar we grow is, the emerald green, the one that we typically grow as a hedge. It's a little bit more dwarf. This is a tree that is very hardy, grows in really cold climates, does well in consistently moist soils, can take some shade, but won't be nearly as dense as if it would be in full sun. Obviously, we typically see this locally as a hedge, and that's great as long as you give it enough space to grow. The biggest issue can be with this tree is that it's susceptible to damage from heavy ice and snow loads, so be careful with that. If you have a lot of ice and snow coming, shake it off if you can. Otherwise, if you have branches that kind of bulge out, they can kind of get heavy and fall and break, and snap. Another thing is too, they're very susceptible to deer browsing, as probably a lot of you know. You might see older ones where the deer have eaten all the way to where they can reach, and so they kind of look like suckers, which is kind of weird, but They're also very tolerant to our hot, humid summers, and they have a great pH tolerance. These are very easy to source. You can find these at most big box like stores like Home Depot and Lowe's. So as you've probably seen, and they're pretty inexpensive too, and they grow moderately fast. Now, one that's becoming, I think, more popular in landscapes is the Thuga Green Giant. It's a cross between the Japanese Thuga and Standishii and the one of the Pacific Northwest Placata. Neither of these alone kind of do great for us here, but when they're crossed in this hybrid form, they do wonderful. They're hardy to zone 5 to 8. Now, I think I did see some desiccation and winter burn on the ones this past year, but typically they are fairly hardy and do pretty well for us. I've heard these have much better deer resistance compared to the Eastern Arborvitae, the Thuga occidentalis. So this might be a better choice. But the only thing is with this is that these get very large. Even Green Giant, which is maybe more of a dwarf cultivar of that hybrid, you still want to make sure they have adequate space as a hedge. And if you plant them near a home or anything, they can get very large. So just consider that when you're thinking of a plant for a hedge. They do tolerate full sun. In part shade conditions, they'll be a bit more sparse and less dense, moist soil, great pH tolerance. They are susceptible to bagworms, so keep that in mind. There might be some damage there. The other great thing is that they're very easy to source and they grow pretty fast. So I would say a lot faster than the Arborvitae occidentalis. Ilex opaca, I do love hollies and I do love the native holly. Now, where you'd find this growing more so is Eastern Kentucky, throughout the Appalachian area. So it does like a lower pH. You can grow them here, but the issue, of course, is that they can get chlorosis in an alkaline soil. So kind of anything above 6.8, they're going to struggle a bit. I would recommend, if you love hollies, this is one that has a decent hardiness for us. A lot of the European bluer kind of hollies, they often can get really bad winter dieback in a cold winter. So I think our native one is a little bit hardier. So if you can get the pH right, this is a really lovely plant. It can do well. It can get to be a very kind of a small tree in the right setting. And it gets a lot denser if it is in full sun. Keep in mind though, this is a tree, or this is a species that is dioecious, meaning that you're going to have a male and female plant to have those famous red berries present. A lot of times when you buy this species, Ilex opaca, it's going to come in cultivars and they might have the word king or queen in the name to indicate whether it's a male or female. So you want to have at least one male for, I think, 3 or 4 or so female plants to make sure they have adequate pollination and make sure they're close enough together. You can get this as a straight species. It's a little bit harder to find, I've found, and also you can't guarantee the sex of the tree until it reaches a level of maturity. So look out for this tree. I think it's a great holly if you can get the conditions right. So think about that one. Japanese white pine. Apparently, this is a really great conifer for us. Has a pretty good pH tolerance. I've only been able to buy and come across this particular white pine in the Glauca cultivar, which has a more silver blue foliage. Does really well in our winters. I will say, compared to our American white pine, Eastern white pine, it has a bit of more of a rounded kind of open habit, but it's really lovely as well. Moderately easy to source. I think we got ours from Conifer Kingdom, which is an online nursery, and it's fully hardy here too. Picea omoreica, Serbian spruce, somewhat hard to source, very, very narrow spruce. You can see in those photos there, that is a straight species. And I think what a great plant for a narrow spot if you're looking for a conifer. It is pretty, has a great tolerance to hot, humid summers, has a wonderful pH tolerance, and it's apparently very tolerant of urban conditions. So that kind of checks a lot of boxes for a lot of conifers that won't work well. So look for this one if you can find it. Hard to source. We do have this one, and I don't remember where we got it from. At the very last slide, I'm going to share you, I think, a list of all the nurseries where I got our evergreens from. So I'll see if I remember which one it was. and it is hardy here too. Alaskan cedar. So this is a native to the West Coast, specifically the Pacific Northwest, up to the coastline into Canada and Alaska, of course, where it gets its name. It has changed its genus to Xanthocyparis newtcatensis, which doesn't really matter if you can call it Chamaecyparis, but you'll still see it. You'll find it online. It has a great pH tolerance. Typically, you can't really buy this as I find as a straight species. It almost always comes in the form of Glaucopendula, which is a really gorgeous weeping form. I would say this is a really lovely juniper looking like tree. I think from a distance, you might see and think this is a small Norway spruce because of the way it kind of weeps and is more pendulous, but this is a really lovely plant. It does pretty well. It doesn't get that tall either. Maybe 30 feet tall at maturity, 14 feet wide over 35 years. This is a wonderful tree to use in a small space, and it has a really great growth pattern and habit. So I would consider, I have this plant personally at my house, and I really love this one. So I'm a little biased. Abies pinsapo, Spanish fir. So of firs, this has one of the best heat and drought tolerances. This one is native to Spain. And we have this one at our office. We have the form, I think it's Glauca, which is a cultivar. Now, to me, this one has one of the stiffest needles I've ever seen on a fir, and it's a bluish color. So I'm thinking in time, if you look up Abies pinsapo Glauca, I think it looks a bit like a blue spruce, and that was intentional because I wanted to see how this would do as it matured, what it would look like. And so if you can find it in any form, I would suggest maybe trying it. It is hardy here, even in zone 6 up to 7. So maybe it will do okay in the future. Not entirely sure. But at the moment, ours is looking pretty good. The pH tolerance is pretty good at 7.5. Full sun for sure. No shade tolerance for this one. It is pretty slow growing, but unfortunately, it's also hard to source. But you can see even in that photo, and that's probably a very mountainous, windy hillside, it has very stiff, short needles. Pinus coreensis. Believe it or not, this is where pine nuts come from in this species. Now, pine nuts also come from an Italian species, which was obviously, it's often used to make pesto. But this is a really great pine. Typically, you find this in a form that is a cultivar that's more of a blue color, I find in the trade. It has a very great tolerance to clay soil, suitable for urban conditions, has a pH that is pretty great for us here, good hardiness at 4 to 7, though apparently it does have susceptibility to tip blight and pine needle scale, though I have seen it looking really great. So maybe that is the case, but I think it's still worth giving a shot and trying it out. So unfortunately, it's also hard to source, but we did find this one, and I think we got it in the form Galaka, but it's quite lovely. So incense cedar, for a while, I didn't really think we could grow this tree until I saw this at Spring Grove, and it was, I think, about 80 feet tall. There was 2 of them. This tree is famous. It ranges all the way from California, I think, all the way up to Oregon, Washington. This is a incense cedar, not a true cedar. It's more closely related to juniper, but it's famous for its intense smell. It's very, very fragrant when you crush the needles, kind of like when you crush an arborvitae, similar smell, very fragrant, kind of a cedar lemony smell. This is famous for that. It was used originally to make pencils back in the day, wood pencils. But one thing that's really great about this tree is that while it's not an arborvitae, it is a really lovely specimen with a great hardiness, great pH tolerance, and it does well in full sun to part shade. It's pretty narrow in habit, and apparently it grows it's pretty tolerant of moist conditions, kind of also like arborvitae. So if you're looking for a spot that you're looking for a conifer that's just kind of unique, and you don't want to use an arborvitae, this can be a really lovely plant. And having seen these in person out west, they're beautiful trees. And if you want to see giant ones, maybe state champion trees, I would say go check them out at Spring Grove. They're pretty majestic. Okay, if you're looking for the best, most tolerant evergreen plants for our area, for sure you have to go with the Eastern Red Cedar. I think in Northern Kentucky, or maybe even the whole Bluegrass ecoregion, this might be the only true native evergreen. So this is completely native here. This tree is hardy from zones 2 to 9. It can be grown as a screen or hedge, though it won't be nearly as dense as some of the other species we mentioned in previous slides. Has amazing drought tolerance, can also grow in wet soils, grows in full sun. It's dioecious, and so there's male and female plants. If you look right now and go out and look along highways, this is often where you find it, but it grows as a pioneer species in abandoned fields, which some people hate. I tend to love this plant. I embrace it wholeheartedly because it is so tough. It gives so much, and the birds love the especially cedar waxwings love this species. And sometimes this tree, female trees, are so covered in berries, like I've seen a few around me right now, that they almost look blue from a distance. It's unbelievable. So this, if you're looking for the toughest evergreen tree, this is maybe the one for you. It is rot resistant wood. So again, a lot of back in the day, this tree was cut down and used for fence posts because they can last in soil. The heartwood is rot resistant, not the outer, the younger wood, but the heartwood is rot resistant. It has like a ruby color, really beautiful wood, and very historic tree. It can get winter bronzing. Now, this varies from tree to tree. The form also varies dramatically from tree to tree. Some trees are much more narrow, some more rounded and open. It is susceptible to cedar apple rust because they're host species with the two different species between pears and apples and cedars and others in the Rosaceae family. One thing I love too, if you love the look of Italian cypress and you want to grow a tree that looks just like it, but it's hardy, I would very much recommend Taylor. It is a cultivar of our Eastern Red Cedar. It's very narrow. I think it gets between 3 feet wide and 20 feet tall, so it gets really narrow. I have a photo on the right corner. I have this growing personally, and I love this plant, or this particular cultivar. And unfortunately, as a straight species, it's kind of hard to source. You would think, ironically, how weird is it that a wonderful evergreen would be so hard to source, but it is, because a lot of people consider this a weed tree. I just think it kind of has everything you want in a lot of ways, but I don't think a lot of people see what I see. So maybe that'll change. I hope more people recognize all of its wonderful attributes in the future. Virginia pine, another tree I think is underused and underutilized. I think a lot of people are kind of maybe they don't love the form of this tree, and they don't see its kind of rangy look as beautiful as maybe a white pine or other evergreens. But I think this is a really tough tree that is also native in a lot of Kentucky, even in the bluegrass ecoregions. So I will see this occasionally around where I'm at too. Has a hardiness of 4 to 8, pH range of 4.5 to 7.5, can grow in urban, tolerates urban pollution. This is, again, more of a pioneer species, so you won't really ever see this growing in shade. It does tend to grow more on slopes in areas where it can get full sun. You often will see these just covered in cones, and I have a feeling it's to do with fire. And so I think it holds onto those cones for a long period until it gets, until it drops them for reasons that pertain to fire. But anyways, this is a tree that can tolerate heavy clay soil, dry soil, sandy loams, good drainage, and it gets very tall, and it has a really beautiful kind of reddish brown bark, especially as it gets older. You can see a ton of these in the mature form at Bernheim. Really wonderful tree, and I think it's a little bit underrated, and I think it deserves more attention, I think, for more people around on our area. Chinese juniper, kind of like Eastern Red Cedar a little bit, but a little bit different. This tree, though, is seldom damaged by deer, has good tolerance of air pollution and good salt tolerance. There's a lot of cultivars out there that are available. I think we have the one at our office is I think called Spartan, which is a bit more erect and narrow in habit, which is actually quite lovely. So it's not quite maybe as narrow as a Taylor juniper, Eastern red cedar, but there's different cultivars of these that are blue, a bit more bluish and more narrow. So look out for the cultivars of this. Has a really great tolerance to a high alkaline soil, needs well-drained soil, and also can tolerate slight drought. So this can also be a great species to check out. Leatherleaf viburnum. So here we're now going to get into some of our broadleaf evergreens. Leatherleaf viburnum is actually a really tolerant tree of it's tolerant of both quite heavy shade as well as full sun. And I think in heavy shade, it's not going to be nearly as dense. But if you have a very shady habit, this still might work for you. Now, what's really great about this tree is that even though it's not fully evergreen, it can be pretty evergreen in a sheltered spot, has a pretty good pH tolerance. In fact, I think it's at least tolerant to 7, if not higher, but I think online sources will say it's only to 6.6, but I think it is higher than that. Leather-like leaves, beautiful leaves. The undersides are quite light in color, so good contrast. You do have to be careful with touching this tree because it can cause allergens and a rash on your hands or face, so just be careful with handling it. Great as a hedge, semi-evergreen. Now you will see in drying winds, it's going to curl a bit more, especially in drought and in winter. So keep that in mind where you plant it. Has beautiful flat cymes of white flowers, and it gets berries, which change to a glossy black. These can be pruned into a shrub and hedge and kept into a certain size, but I would say again, give it adequate room to grow. 6 to 10 feet tall and wide, I would say. Hardy here, definitely 6 to zone 6. I think, again, when it's a little bit colder, it'll just be more deciduous. I don't think it's moderately hard to source. I think it's pretty easy to source, but it depends on maybe your availability to either buying things online or in person. Magnolia grandiflora, one of my favorite trees of all time. Now, this tree is planted quite a lot. People really love this because it looks so tropical. The flowers are gigantic. They smell so fragrant of kind of a lemon, and they get kind of large, especially the straight species. They're hardy to zone 5 to 8. Now, pretty much what I would recommend is with this species is that you go for cultivars that can handle colder winters, because in a cold winter, you can have a lot of dieback, you can have defoliation, wind scald. So the best ones, which I don't know why I didn't put these on here. The other one I have is Edith Bow, which is one of the ones with a very large leaf closer to the straight species that has it might be the hardiest cultivar of Magnolia grandiflora. And that one's Edith Bow. Sorry, I didn't write it on there. But other ones include Bracken's Brown Beauty, which is probably the most popular one in the trade right now. Smaller leaves than the straight species, but it has that beautiful brown tomentose fuzzy underside that looks great in wreaths and arrangements. Beautiful contrast. And the flowers are also equally fragrant, but they're just a little bit smaller. And that one's also a little bit more of a smaller tree and more of a rounded habit and more shrub-like rather than a tree. They're pretty easy to source. You'll find these at nurseries. They can grow fast in optimal conditions, but I would say more of a moderate growth habit. Can tolerate moist soils. They don't love to be in dry areas. pH tolerance is up to 5.5, and they are hardy. So you can use them as a screen or hedge, but I would say make sure they have adequate space to grow. So try to keep them out of cold, drying winds, because as a broadleaf evergreen, they are susceptible to that. So keep that in mind. Magnolia virginiana, hardier than the grandiflora. And so this tree is not, for us, this is not a true evergreen here. Typically, you'll find this to be semi-evergreen unless it's in a really sheltered, maybe courtyard or against a wall. So this tree is often called swamp. Sometimes it's it's found growing in a very moist habitat. So they can tolerate pretty moist soils. I see this now often used in urban settings, and I've seen this as a street tree, which is kind of surprising because I wouldn't have thought that, but I do see that in certain places. So this is a smaller magnolia, maybe 25, 30 feet. Maybe you'd find around here at maturity. Hardiness 5 to 10, so very cold hardy. Very fragrant flowers that kind of bloom sporadically throughout the summer, similar to the grandiflora. So it's nice to have flowers that are not just a big flush all at once. You can kind of enjoy them, especially for ones that are fragrant. You can enjoy that for a longer period of time. They can tolerate part shade through full sun. What else can I say? Hicks Best and Northern Belle are two cultivars I found, but they're super hard to find. But they apparently have a better hold onto their leaves in a colder winter than most of the straight species would. So they're a bit more evergreen than the straight species for us here, but it's difficult to find those two cultivars. So you can find the straight species quite often. Pinus spongiana, lacebark pine. This is one of the coolest trees I've ever seen. If you've ever seen a mature specimen of this, the bark looks like camo. It's often a multi-trunked pine tree, has a really great pH tolerance, fully hardy here. This is a tree native to Asia, moderately hard to source, but if you're looking for something a bit more unusual, maybe something for bonsai or a specimen pine, this is a wonderful tree, especially when it reaches maturity and can show off that bark. So really cool plant if you've ever seen it before. Japanese red pine, hard to source. I don't know if I've seen one of these locally, but a lot of people might look at this and think it's a Scots pine, but it's a little bit different, more of a reddish copper color bark with age, but it might be potentially suited to our region. And kind of like the Scots pine too, as it ages, it's going to get a really long trunk and kind of have a rounded top to it and nothing below it. So it's going to kind of look like maybe a lollipop. But that's just their habit. That's how they operate. Has a good pH tolerance. I think it's a bit higher than this, but we'll say for at least it's to 6.5. It is fully hardy here, from sand to clay, but again, it might need to have a better soil drainage. Hybrid yew, Taxus media. So this typically when we are buying yew hedges, this is the hybrid we're looking at. Texas X Media is a hybrid yew crossing the Japanese yew. So it's crossing the winter hardiness from the English yew or the European yew with the heat tolerance of the Japanese yew, and you're getting this wonderful hybrid. And so it has a great hardiness, wonderful pH tolerance. Compared to boxwood, with the past winter, a lot of the yews were unscathed. They are just so tough, and they can be cut into old wood. So if you let a yew grow to full size, it will become a small tree, but typically we grow yew as a hedge. The only real issue with yew is that it needs well-drained soil. It is prone to root rot, so keep that in mind. And make sure you plant it in a space where if you can't prune it tightly and keep it in a small spot, you want to give it adequate space. So many people plant this as a foundation plant, which can be great, but you want to make sure you prune it correctly. Otherwise, you're going to have to do really severe cutbacks, which might not look great for a number of years if you're trying to do a rejuvenation prune. So keep that in mind. There's many cultivars out there. One that is more of a spreading habit is densiformis, and then Hicksii is more of a narrow form. You often will find these at big box stores. So these are two very common cultivars you'll find this hybrid as. So very easy to source. I think we have all seen these plants. Also, one of the best evergreens for full shade tolerance. You can easily see these growing quite well under a deciduous forest. So they do pretty well if you have a shady spot. Last one on my list, one I think can be good, but is very ornamental, is the Pyracantha coccinea firethorn. Now, this has a great pH tolerance and it is hardy, but I will say the biggest issue with this can be fire blight and scab. Because it is in the Rosaceae family, it does have some of those same issues. So you want to look for ones that have been bred to have better resistance to those, such as Rutgers and Teton. These come in a wide variety of berries from orange to yellow to red, and they mature in the winter. And so they kind of persist on these arching evergreen branches that are very thorny for a long time in winter. And that's beautiful because you can use them in arrangements, and birds sometimes do eat them, but they take months until they get to a point where birds want to eat them. So they're highly attractive and ornamental. And these can be trained to grow up a wall or as a hedge. They're kind of great for privacy, but I don't see these very often sold anymore. So I think they've gone out of fashion in a lot of ways, but I think they're still quite lovely. So keep these in mind if you see them. They might be a good choice too. The only thing I wanted to mention was before I finish off is Forest Farm. A lot of the very hard to get conifers I found. This is a nursery in Oregon. They ship these conifers. Conifer Kingdom has some. Woody Warehouse has some. And then Google searches. So these vendors I found typically through doing Google searches and just doing research online. And it's worth looking for if you're looking for something that's a bit more unique that isn't available in the trade. And so, yeah, good luck finding any of these because I'll try my best to help you if I can, but I know it isn't easy. And it's unfortunate because I feel like in the future, a lot of the ones that are hard to source now will be the best ones for our region in the future. And I'm hoping that in enough time, they'll be more available in the trade, the horticulture trade. So, and that's kind of it. Sorry, Ellen, I think I went over.
No, that was wonderful. So much really fantastic information. Um, Not only do I have so many new plants I want to check out, but places that I want to go visit. If you haven't been to some of the locations that Brandon mentioned to check out their plants, I really recommend it. Super fun. And I think that the something I heard over and over again was this can be hard to source.
Yeah, yeah. Yes.
Yeah, this could be hard to source. And so I think hopefully that's something that increasing, recognizing these plants will improve over time as we're trying to find more evergreens for our area.
Mhm.
Um, Before we go to any questions that you have, and if you have any questions for Brandon, please put those in the chat. I also want to share a survey. We want to hear from you about these Tree Week webinars. So I'm going to put this survey link in the chat as well. You can also take a picture of that QR code with your phone and complete it that way. But let us know, what you think and what we can be doing in the future. So I have a comment from Eastern Kentucky saying evergreens usually do wonderful for an average of 20 years. Then almost overnight they start going downhill fast. Um, and that's why, some of the ones that you mentioned, the top of your list, that Colorado blue spruce for things not to plant, I think of that as a temporary tree. It's
Yeah.
like a couple steps up from like a plastic tree for sure, but it's not going to be a long-lived tree. And
Yep.
so, when you've got that, it is a temporary tree.
I would agree. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so some challenges there. Any other questions? If you've got them, put them in the chat or the Q&A. And yeah, a lot of wonderful things to check out. I really want to see the bark on that
Oh
was
my
it
gosh.
lace bark that you mentioned?
Yes, Ellen, you have to go to, if you're next time you're at Spring Grove, they
Yeah.
have a very old specimen there, and it literally looks like camo, the bark. It's just the
It is
coolest thing.
interesting. Yeah. And
Yeah.
something we didn't get to today, because your presentation was focused on evergreens and semi-evergreens, is that there are also, and a question I get a lot of is I want a native species but that's evergreen. And really, we don't have many
Eastern
options.
red
You
cedar.
mentioned East cedar, and white pine,
Yeah.
depending on where you're at.
Mhm.
But I think something that people overlook is that we do have native species that have beautiful winter appeal. They might not be
Yeah.
evergreen, but some gorgeous bark and
Yeah.
form and colors that might be of interest. It won't be the evergreen, but that could fit some of that desire. I'm thinking of things like our native red twig
Yeah. I was the first one I was
dogwood.
gonna say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that one.
No, me
Um,
too. Yeah.
Yeah, so different things are out there that won't quite do that evergreen, but still have some winter appeal.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think another thing a lot of people overlook is if you do have like a hedge or an evergreen screen, if you put a really interesting bark in front of it, it draws the color even brighter
Mm,
because you have that dark backsplash. And I've seen this
mm,
a lot in the UK where they have yew hedges and they plant like cultivars of cornice, and you're like, oh my God, it looks like the
yeah.
garden's on fire in the winter. It's incredible how you can use that as art. So,
All right. Well, thank you again. And just a reminder to everyone, we have more Tree Week webinars coming up. We've got tomorrow, we have the From the Woods Today show, and we're doing a special on Tree Week. But then Thursday, we've got a couple great webinars. We have our own Kelly Jackson from Christian County Cooperative Extension is going to be talking about how to water landscape trees effectively. We've got a webinar on managing forests in the face of climate change. And then on Friday, we have two webinars as well, one on invasive trees and one on campus wood and wood utilization. So how do we use wood sustainably in an urban environment? So should be really interesting as well. And for any who are interested, these webinars are all recorded and will be posted online as a playlist in YouTube. And I will drop the link for that in just a minute. So with that, want to wrap up today. I'm going to stop the recording, but thank you for joining us and enjoy Tree Week. Hope you're out shopping around for some new trees, evergreens, and others. And I want to give a huge shout out to Brandon George for this incredible presentation on evergreens. So many trees and so little time,
yes.
right? So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.